Picture what leadership would be if it was a person. If you could just pick anybody, what does that person look like? What are they wearing? How do they speak? And try to create an image in your mind of who a great leader looks like, what they speak, what they say, how they speak, and ultimately, everything about them. Create that mental image of them. I bet that more often than not, you probably thought of somebody like a corporate leader, a CEO, maybe even Elon Musk. Or you might think about somebody who has like a drill sergeant, type of a persona about them, right? Like somebody who's very confident. And if you did, then that puts you in most of what Americans would consider to be strong leadership. That's because in the US and in the American workplace, we tend to lead via something called achievement style leadership. And achievement style leadership is gained through experiences. By the way, this is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with this. But that creates an image of what leadership looks like. But I'm going to give you a different example. I want you to think about Princess Diana. I want you to think about Mother Teresa or Gandhi. Do they seem to fit the description that you initially thought about leadership? My guess is probably not. Now, there is going to be some of you who absolutely went there. And if so, this means that you tend to lead more via something called a scriptional relationship. Neither one is better than the other. They're just different. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because ultimately, the way that we lead and the way that we lead other people within our organizations matters. And if we are leading people inconsistent with the way that we want to lead them, then that can create a problem. Before we do that though, I want to turn over here. At the end of the day, the reason why people lead is because they want to be successful or they want other people to be successful. Ideally, we want both, right? So a good leader is somebody who sees their success as important to them and their identity, but also in the service of others, right? Ultimately, this is the best type of leadership that we can hope for. And that's ultimately what success is. Now, we're going to take a quick second here to define success before we dive into leadership. I came around this definition of success a couple years ago, and I haven't found a better definition. Success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. Now, this is coined by a gentleman by the name of Earl Nightingale, who has, many different types of influences back in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. There's a bunch of information and videos on him, so if you want to look him up, he's a great person to follow and to draw inspiration from. But ultimately, this definition, to me, really strikes that line between the idea of continuous improvement, of trying to improve ourselves every day, while acknowledging the fact that we're chasing after something that is worth doing, right? That's that worthy ideal. Which, by the way, I wanted to define that. So if success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal, then what is an ideal? So let's define that. An ideal is an idea that you have fallen in love with. Okay? So an ideal is an idea that you have fallen in love with. Success is a progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So in other words, success is the continued attention and focus on an idea or a goal that you have fallen in love with. So whatever that might be for you, that's how you're going to continue to achieve success. And that ultimately shows up very differently depending on who you are. Let me know what you think about that definition, but we're going to step into this topic now, and we're going to flip this board over to make it a little simpler. Okay. So we talked about two different styles of leadership. First, we're going to start with achievement. We're going to break this down. So first and foremost, when we think about somebody who leads via achievement, These are people who are focused on performance. Their focus is on competence, and they tend to have a direct communication. Think about like the typical, American workplace. When you find yourself like in a process or a meeting or improving anything, the main focus here is going to be on your performance, and your performance is measured by how you can get things done, right? And then your competence. So when you think about, let's just use Bill as an example, because we'll just kind of use these two different people here. So Bill is somebody who leads via achievement. So Bill is organized, he's very structured, he has certain tenure within the organization, he understands how to do his job. He holds himself to a very high standard. So Bill is somebody who understands that to be successful within the workplace, you need to accomplish a certain number of things every day. So this is the type of person who, gets up early, will make a list of things that they need to do during the day, and then goes about checking those things off his list. And by the way, it's a phenomenal style of leadership. They also tend to be known as pace setters. You might hear that term thrown around every now and then. So a pace setter is somebody who says, here, let me show you how to do this. So achievement is a great way to encourage people to perform. So if you happen to be a leader and you have this style, which is very common, like I mentioned, in the American workplace, then more often than not, people look up to you. They look up to you for guidance. They look up to you for how to complete a certain number of things. And that's going to build your credibility as a leader, because you know how to do things, and then you have an openness or a willingness to teach others. It's an absolutely phenomenal style of leadership. So we're going to put a star here. Definitely works in our favor. So if this is the way that you tend to lead, you don't have to do anything different. And by the way, we're going to get to the other one here in just a moment. But all this means is that you tend to have a very structured way about your leadership. And you tend to, remember, we talked in a different video, but we use the example right here of a checklist. So, you have a certain number of things that you need to do, and we're going to try to check those things off the list. There are different cultural norms that we talk about. So sometimes we use these different icons as a way to try to remember the things that we discuss, because the words sometimes escape even my own memory. So let's take that step back again. So types of leadership, more often than not, if you work in the American workplace, you're going to have this style of leadership. And this is what we're going to aspire to, right? The other thing is competence. So not only do you achieve your results via your performance, you are viewed as competent. And competence comes from a variety of sources. One is your own skills and merit and abilities and experience that you've achieved over, think of, like, for instance, a teenage driver, right? They're not very competent driving because they're learning how to drive. But think about somebody who's been driving for 20 years, they could probably drive pretty easily because they've achieved a certain degree of competence around that. Now, if I were to put you in a plane and say, hey, I need you to fly this plane, you might think to yourself, well, I have no idea how to do this, because you've never done it. So your competence around flying a plane is very low, at least relative to driving a car, which is another great point. Competence is relative. So we're going to write that word here. Why is this important? Because it's very common for people to pigeonhole others, and especially leaders, based on their competence for one specific area. So for example, if I were measuring you on your ability to drive a car, you would have a high degree of competence. But if I were measuring you on your ability to fly a plane, you would have a very low degree of competence. Now, this is still the same person. We're still talking about Bill, and Bill is an extremely strong performer, but he is incompetent with flying a plane because he doesn't know how to fly a plane. So we have to be very careful with how we assign a person's impression of their leadership based solely on competence, because competence is very relative. So it's very important to keep this in mind. The example I just gave you is very obvious, but think about something that you would do at work every day that for you is very easy or standard. But if you ask somebody else to do it, they may not know how to do that because they haven't learned it yet. But it doesn't mean that they're incompetent. It just means that they haven't developed competence in whatever you need them to do. That opens another category, which is maybe Bill gets flustered with too many things. So for instance, if you think about flying a plane, you have a number of gauges that you have to pay attention to, and you have to coordinate with air traffic control. So there's a lot of things vying for your attention all at once, and you have to know how to do those all simultaneously. Maybe the idea of multitasking. So potentially Bill, although he's an incredibly intelligent and efficient and strong leader, as well as an individual performer, he doesn't do very well with multitasking. So for instance, Bill might be really good at doing one thing or two things and getting those two things done very well, but he's not very good at managing 10 things all at once. However, there are other people who do that very well. They might get a little, antsy with trying to do just one or two things, but if you give them 5 or 6 things, they like the challenge of working on multiple things all at once, which also opens its door to its own cultural, organic portion of an individual who we'll talk about that at a different time. But so right now we're defining these different forms of achievement, and this is very common, like we've mentioned in the American workplace. The other thing about this style of leadership is it tends to have a very direct form of communication. So the way that people speak when they lead from achievement tends to be very direct. So for example, if you have a supervisor who leads via achievement, more often than not, they're going to tell you, hey, Bill, did you finish that report that I asked you to do? So they're going to be very direct. It's not meant to be threatening. It's not meant to be, they're not like upset at you. It's just the way that they speak is very direct. And we'll talk about the forms of communication in a different video, but direct communication tends to be very unambiguous. The focus with direct communication is on clarity. So it may at times lack warmth because the focus isn't on relationship as it would be with indirect communication, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, but rather on effectiveness and on clarity. So that's why you might have somebody who says, Bill, did you finish that report I asked you to do? They're not upset at you. They're not mad. They're just basically operating from this lens of direct communication, which aligns very well with achievement. Now, we're going to move over to the other side of this board, which is ascription and relationship. More often than not, we're going to find that people who lead via achievement tend to get more immediate status from the people they lead because they're viewed as competent and as high performers. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why people tend to shy away from this other style of leadership, because in their minds they're thinking, I want to be viewed as competent. I want to be viewed as being a high performer. I want to be viewed as achieving things and getting things done on time. And that's for that reason, and because culturally speaking, we're very primed to seek those that are achievement type leaders, then we all try to go this route, right? So that said, when we think about those individuals like Mother Teresa, who we mentioned earlier, or Princess Diana, those leaders exhibited a tremendous amount of goodwill for the people that they led. And in many ways, they became even more memorable because they led through a different set of cultural skills, which we're going to discuss here in just a moment. Okay, so when we lead from ascription, we tend to focus on who a person is and their connections. So, for example, if we're going to go back to this example of Princess Diana. So Princess Diana was a princess, she was part of the monarchy. She had really strong connections to the English monarchy. And because of those connections, she was able to access a lot of resources. The thing or the difference with her style of leadership is that she utilized those resources for the advancement of mankind, right? Of other humans, especially people who were more disadvantaged than she was. And that's why she's very memorable. But I also want to like land this into something that we can all think about from a day-to-day interaction. People who tend to be more ascriptive in the way that they lead tend to leverage those resources. So maybe to use a small icon, we're going to think about, I cannot draw a hand to save my life, but think about this as two people shaking hands. So we're basically trying to find a way to become to make this easier to remember. But when we focus on this type of leadership, or when we just happen to lead via ascription or relationship, we're focused on the relationship more so than we are on competence or performance. By the way, this doesn't mean that people who lead this way aren't high performers or competent. In fact, more often than not, they are incredibly competent, but they don't necessarily lead with that competence. They lead via a different set of skills, which is driven by that relationship. So now there are basement qualities to either of them, and we'll discuss them in a moment, but who a person is and their connections is how they lead. So remember the example of Princess Diana, because it's just super easy, right? So she was a princess. She had strong connections within the English monarchy. And as a result of those connections, she could use those connections for the benefit of others. Well, now let's use that same analogy from a more traditional leadership perspective. So say that you are, somebody who works a traditional 9-to-5. Well, you're going to have a certain network, right? You're going to have met people along the way. You might have had mentors or sponsors or people that have helped you. That is your network. So those are the resources that you're going to be able to leverage, much in the same way as Princess Diana leveraged the resources of the English monarchy to support her efforts. And what was, remember the success? The progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So that's what Princess Diana had fallen in love with, the idea of providing dignity for all people, especially those that were marginalized or disenfranchised or less fortunate than she was. That was her mission. And that's why we wanted to start the conversation with, what is success to you? Because maybe to you, success is, I want to become the vice president of my organization. And when I become the vice president of my organization, I will have achieved what in my mind is a successful life. And there's no judgment here, by the way. That is a perfectly valid and strong goal. Maybe you want to be the owner of a company. Maybe you want to start a business and hire people, which is another very worthy ideal. But ultimately, begin with that in mind, because that's going to help shape your leadership. If you wish to become the vice president of an organization, you can achieve it both ways, but you're definitely going to have to focus a lot of your time and effort and energy on these pillars right here. Whereas if, I can't pronounce her last name, Jane, I think her name is Goodall. She was the lady who I think actually recently passed away that really focused her entire life on studying gorillas. And I can't think of her last name, Jane something. Anyway, she didn't care about being the vice president of an organization. She cared about studying and understanding gorillas and their natural habitat. And in the process of doing that, she became, like a modern day, Jane Tarzan type woman, where she developed this incredible passion and love for these creatures and helped advance a lot of scientific knowledge of this animal that wouldn't have been available had her mission not been that, right? So, but ultimately she had more of this in mind, while still, obviously displaying competence and certain skills that she needed in order to advance her goals. Now, why does ascription matter significantly, or what are the things rather that matter significantly when we're leaning with ascription? When we lean this way, one of the most important things is developing trust. So developing trust, creating cooperation, and then building harmony. We're going to get into harmony here in just a moment, but think about, first and foremost, trust. So if you are going to lead people they need to be able to trust you. And in order to trust you, you have to build some foundation that is trustworthy. So this is where, if we go back to the achievement side of things, people will tend to, focus on performance. If I need to complete this task by this day and I do it, then I build credibility and I build trustworthiness. And those are great skills. But you can also build trust differently. I'll give you an example. In a recent meeting, I challenged the opinion of one of my peers, and that tends to break the harmony, right? So when we think about harmony, is the degree to which we can coexist in a harmonious way. And this actually matters quite a bit, because here, I'll give you a different example. Remember the book, The Lord of the Flies, which was all those kids that were abandoned in that island? Or, that's a great example, but it's a novel. But how the lack of harmony and cohesion ultimately destroyed that group. But you can think about this every day. We see this at airports. Like when a flight is delayed, you just see people left and right scowl and, cussing, and then they take it out on the flight attendants or the flight agents. And, these poor people are not responsible for a flight being delayed. Right now, I get it. I've been through those many times, and it is frustrating. But here's an example of how we can see harmony being destroyed at the expense of something I want. And that's why, by the way, trust and cooperation are hugely important when we focus on this style of leadership. We don't tend to see emergencies in a corporate setting. Like if I gave you this example just now, the Lord of the Flies, like when are we going to find 50 kids abandoned in an island? Probably never. But and even like the airport example, that might happen 3 times a year, if that, right? And then still, it happens very infrequently, that we tend to not focus on those. But ultimately, building harmony, cooperation, and trust with the people that we work with on a daily basis is foundational to our own performance and competence, because we do have to work with and through people. And that's a good thing, by the way. And if we don't build trust, if we don't build that cooperation and drive and strive to cooperate, then we're going to be left alone in an island of ourselves, right? So that's the little icon here with the handshake. So the ability to create trust means I have to look outside of myself. And this means, how can I help? And it's not just my supervisor or my work group or my immediate team, but rather, how can I literally help another individual that will benefit from my skill, my experience, my competence, my performance? And then when you begin to lead that way, you really lean into this ascription type form of leadership. In an ideal world, you would have both, and you would learn to use them and exercise them in different ways. However, and I'm usually not a huge fan of these things, but think of them a little bit like a scale. At least it won't hurt to think about it that way. So you have a scale here. This is probably not, the best type of scale, but in a way, you're going to lean more towards this style, or you're going to lean a little bit more towards this style. Although, metaphor here, you can always make the scale larger. So you can lead and make a significant impact in your leadership by having both and really exhibiting them earnestly, right? But in a way, it is a little bit like a scale. So you have to learn how and when to exercise these different styles of leadership. So let's move back to trust and cooperation. I think trust is understood well enough. So this is the ability to be trustworthy by, following my own word, by doing the things that I said that I was going to do, by completing tasks on time. So in a way, it does have a formal structure too, because that's how I built trustworthiness, right? As far as cooperation goes, it really matters. And we're going to get into a different cultural norm later where we're going to talk a lot more about cooperation. But people tend to think about like teamwork. Okay, that makes sense. But there's so much more to effective cooperation than just saying teamwork. And this is something that comes out of 2 cultural norms that are actually, in a way, opposing. which is individualism and collectivism. We'll talk about those in a different video, but the idea behind individualism and collectivism is when somebody leads with individualism, not like in a selfish way, but rather just from that cultural inclination, they're very focused on autonomy. So this is where people would say, we're going to do a team project here. I'm going to do this. You're going to do that. She's going to do that. And then we're going to all get together and put it together. So that's a very individualistic framework where you still exhibit cooperation, but from an individualistic frame of mind. Somebody who operates from a collectivist frame of mind and is seeking cooperation would bring that group together and say, how do we do this together? And yes, there is a component of efficiency with individualism, but that efficiency comes at the expense of further relationships. So for instance, you might get something done very quickly today, but when you have to meet with that group again tomorrow, you've kind of chipped away a little bit at that harmony because you never focused on building the relationship. So that's why it matters, because if you're going to work with somebody for 5 or 10 years and you only meet with them and then you kind of divvy out the workload, then you never build a relationship. A great example, going back to the airport example, is they talk about the layover theory. So if you had a 1.5 or 2 hour layover at an airport, would you want to spend time with that individual, or would you go on your own and kind of just like do your own thing? And that's a great way to know. And by the way, use this example on you. So for instance, if I'm working with Bill and Bill and I are traveling together and we have a 2 hour layover, and we notice like, oh, we're gonna have this 2 hour layover, and I tell Bill, hey, let's go grab some lunch, and Bill tells me, no thanks, I'm just gonna go read a book over here or something. In a way, that's telling of my leadership, right? So it's also telling of Bill's leadership and his own cultural inclination. But somebody who says, no thanks, I'll just kind of do my own thing, in a way they are focused on, or not focused, they are aware of the fact that there's very little harmony and cooperation between those two people because it hasn't been built. And people who are overly focused on this sometimes struggle with harmony because they haven't built it, right? So, gosh, I mean, it sounds like I'm going to bash Camille and I'm like overly focused on the English monarchy, but it's such a good example. Like when we think about Princess Diana, like from what I remember, when I was a kid and I remember seeing all those images and whatnot, she was just like such a loved person, right? Whereas you think of Camilla, who took her place and like nobody ever hears anything about her. And I have no idea anything about her. She's probably a perfectly wonderful lady, but at least the impression that one versus the other gives is quite significant in terms of the harmony that they were able to build and the goodwill that comes along with building that harmony. So, something to think about. Lastly, indirect communication is very common when it comes to people who lead with ascription and relationship, because to them, the way that you speak can have an impact. Remember when we talked earlier about the direct style of communication, we said, Bill's supervisors said, Bill, are you done with that report that I asked you to complete? Very direct, unambiguous, focus on clarity. Let's just say that Bill's having a bad day. Let's just say that, Bill's 14-year-old daughter got to detention because she said something unkind to another girl in her class. And now that's on Bill's mind, right? So Bill's thinking like, oh gosh, I have to go to school and speak to the teacher and the principal, and we've been having these issues with her, yada, yada, yada. And then along comes Bill's supervisor, leader, and this person says, Bill, where's that report? Or are you done with the report that I asked you for? So in a way, Bill's probably feeling overly pressured, doesn't really know how to react. He might, spat back, no, but I'll get it done tomorrow, or something to that effect. So in that process, there was a focus on clarity, on competence, on performance. All those things were achieved, but they came at the expense of harmony. And what'll happen is if Bill's boss is emotionally intelligent, he'll notice something's off. He'll say, the way he responded didn't quite come out right. There's something about the situation that I probably should lean into a little bit more. So in an ideal world, Bill's supervisor would approach Bill later in the day and say, Bill, look, I noticed that you're holding maybe some tension, or are you okay? Maybe it's just something as simple as that. Is everything all right? But if Bill's supervisor has developed over time elements of this style of leadership, then Bill will be much more receptive to say, like, no, Jerry, I'm okay. Sorry. I'm just, dealing with a lot right now. My daughter is going through this, has nothing to do with the report. So then in creating that openness or that space, then both Bill and Jerry can cooperate better together, right? Whereas if Jerry, that Bill's boss, never developed those skills, then Bill's kind of left alone on an island, to figure things out for himself. And that might work, once or twice, but eventually that creates burnout, exhaustion, and any number of additional things, not to mention a rupture of confidence, a little bit close to trust, right? Because there wasn't enough time to foster that. So in a way, you have to really focus on both of those things, because you're going to be an incredibly good leader, leading solely by achievement. But if this is your primary and sole objective, it will come at the expense of workplace cooperation and harmony. Conversely, if you're only focused on ascription and relationship, it can slow things down, because ultimately you might be like, let's use this example again with Bill. If Bill's going through a lot and you're Bill's supervisor, Jerry, and you're overly concerned with the cooperation, the harmony, the relationship, then you might tell Bill, hey, Bill, you know what? Don't worry about it. Why don't you go take care of your family? I got it. I'll finish this report. I mean, that's very exemplary. But then what happens tomorrow when Bill has another issue come up? And then 3 days from now when he has another issue come up? And then what happens, 3 weeks from now when he has yet another issue come up? And then what you end up seeing is performance begins to drop, because you're not focused sufficiently on performance. So like I mentioned, this is a little bit like a scale. Some people will have a natural inclination towards one or the other style of leadership, but ideally, you're going to learn how to utilize both of these styles of leadership and to apply them, to first identify them and then apply them in the workplace as you see fit, right? As it matters to the situation that you need to handle. So achievement and ascription, they both work. You just need to know how and when to use them.